Welcome to Going In Blind. I'm your host, Zach Tidwell, and this week I'm speaking with journalist, broadcaster, volunteer EMT, and author Tom Kranz. Tom Kranz, welcome to Going In Blind.
Hey, man, thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on. For people at home, he and I met, I don't know, it's been maybe 2 months ago
Yeah, something like
online.
that.
I was on his podcast, which you need to check out, which is called Type Tune Tint. But Tom has quite the, I would say, quite the broad background, and there's a lot of interesting experiences to touch on. And I really want to dive into all of it with you today because I'm intrigued to hear, especially because you focus now on your own podcast in the creative space, how some of these experiences have led you to where you are today. Because I didn't even realize when we had talked before, when I came on your show, that you had so many, not necessarily tangents to your story, but that your professional background was so broad.
Well, I've done, my whole thing was during life, if opportunities come by, grab them. And, each opportunity was kind of aligned with something that I always wanted to do. I wanted to write. So I became a writer. I wanted to write a lot. So I became a news writer. And then somewhere along the line, I decided I wanted to help people as a volunteer. So I became a volunteer EMT. And then I worked for an assisted living. I just kind of did stuff as it came along. Some of it's survival, but I had some opportunities. So, I'm glad they came along, and I don't really regret anything. I also don't forget the people who screwed me on the way and people who helped me on the way. But it's been fun, and now I'm a semi-old guy, so it's fun to look back on that stuff.
Yeah. Have you always been, obviously there's a long timeline there. I think your background that you sent me kind of starts with at least your professional life. You got your degree in communication and journalism, and then I think your professional story kind of started in the 90s. But have your interests always been very broad like that, or is that just you growing as a person and following
Now,
that?
gosh, I'd hate to say I grew as a person because that would indicate that I actually know what the hell I'm talking about myself. I really always considered myself a journalist first and foremost. I started being interested in, I've always been interested in news from as long as I can remember, watching local news in Philly. And then in high school, I was actually inspired by a couple English teachers, shocking. And I
Was one of them
decided
a
I
hot chick?
no, nothing to do with high. I went to an all-boys public high school, so there were no hot chicks, and all the hot chicks were in girls' high school up the road, and I was such a geek. I didn't have my first girlfriend really until I was like 19, but that's another podcast. I got into news because I really wanted to write, and I remember during a high school career day, one of the people who spoke was a local anchorman, a big shot anchorman in Philadelphia at the time. We're talking, geez, 1972 when I was a senior in high school. And I said, he's talking about if you really want to be in the news business, you have to learn to write. And I took that to heart, and I liked writing anyway. And when you write in the news business, you write about a lot of different things uh, a lot of the time, and you kind of become an expert. No, no, not an expert. You kind of get to know a little bit about a lot of subjects when you write news. And that kind of drew me in. And then when I went to college, I discovered the college radio station, and I really enjoyed being on the radio. I was first a newscaster, and then I learned about jazz, and I became a jazz DJ. So, kind of news, communications, being on the radio, that was all kind of tied into one big bubbling cauldron of passion, I guess. And I went to college for communication at Temple University, and that's what my degree was in, communications with an emphasis in radio, television, film, and journalism.
When you were getting into radio, because it makes me think back to when you hear older radio broadcasters, and it seems like it was kind of as people were figuring out actually having media out there for people to listen to and how to talk, everyone thought that you had to sound fake and be like, well, Tom, not today. Like, was it in that phase when you were kind of having to
Yes, the
act?
answer is yeah. I know what you're asking. The
Okay.
answer is yes. It's not as cartoony as you might think it is. But for example, I mean, the way I talk right now, I'm 70 now, but when I was in my 20s, I had the same voice with the same funky Philadelphia accent, but it was a little stronger. When I did newscasts, I mostly used this voice, but I just made sure I spoke up so that people could hear and understand. Even when you're in front of a microphone, if you speak too quickly or you mumble, you will make people tune out. But my actually first job, excuse me, was at a radio station that played elevator music, right? At the time, the format was called Beautiful Music. And that was the actual name of the format. There's top 40, there's classical. I worked at a beautiful music station, was my first job. I was an overnight announcer. I made $5 an hour. And I was only a junior in college, and I was the envy of my friends because I actually had a job in radio. But
Really?
that radio station was WWSH, and their signature was Wish, WWSH, Stereo 106, all music, all the time. And the trick there is to sound like you're smiling. And I actually was smiling when I said that. And so that's kind of the brand that station went for. But when I read the news, I read it like a normal person. So, I didn't sit there like Gary Marshall did on the old Laugh-In show with my hand to my ear, barking into a microphone like this. That sounds very phony, and it is. I never did that. I was basically myself, and that's kind of what I liked about radio. Is so anonymous. Nobody sees you. They don't need to see you. They kind of make up their own kind of pictures of who you are and what you're talking about. And it's so much easier than TV. Once you start introducing pictures, it's like, Jesus, everything's harder.
And the TV stuff and working for CBS came post college, correct?
Yeah, well, so when I started in college, I started first at that beautiful music station, and then I got a job as a news writer at an all news station, and then that went away. I did that for a couple of years after I graduated, and then I started working at the local TV station, which was right down the hall from the local radio station I worked at, and that was in 1981. So that was my first job. I was a news writer, and then I was there for 11 years, worked my way up to executive producer. I was in charge of the early news shows, and that was fun until I got fired from that job. There was a management change, and they blew a bunch of us out. And then I ended up, that's when first lived in Philadelphia. I was unemployed for 9 months after that. And then I got a job at CBS because I networked and I had a friend up there. And that started in 1992. So, yeah, all the TV stuff was post college for sure.
Okay. And you mentioned writing being an interest this entire time, even as a high schooler and with journalism, it being very broad. But were you writing fiction back then? And we'll get into this, the authorship side of things, but I did want people to know, like, you're working on your eighth book right now. Like there's been a huge progression here, and it seems like almost a break in the timeline some.
So the only fiction I wrote was in high school English classes when Mr. Barsky in 11th grade. Over the years, over that year, we'd have to write, analytic essays about our Shakespeare readings and all that stuff that I hated. But then he would say, write, he would give us a topic, write about something creatively, just make something up. And that's what I loved the most. So that's kind of was my first introduction to writing fiction. I didn't really start writing fiction though until after I left the news business, because it was so freeing to be able to just sit down and make stuff up. After being in the news business for 25 years, I left it in 2007 after I was fired the second time. And I immediately started writing. I had this idea for a book. Over the years, I'd worked for 11 different news directors, and every single one of them had some kind of human dysfunction. With maybe one example, I always thought that to be a news director at CBS, you needed to be there needed to be something wrong with you. And so I wrote my first novel was about a guy who works at a TV network in New York who actually kills his news director boss. And that was kind of cathartic for me because it happened right after I got fired. I was kind of angry and, I just wasn't, I kind of was, I was pissed. So I decided that's what I'm going to write my first book about. That book took me 10 years to write and it was only 150 pages because it's really hard, harder than people think to write a novel, that makes sense, that's a story that has a beginning, middle, and end. And I'd spent my entire life writing, minute and a half scripts for stories that had to be accurate and true. And now I'm making shit up. That was a whole new thing for me. So that was a huge transition to be able to write fiction. And my first novel really shows it. If I look back at it now and I see, a million different things that I would have done differently and maybe different ways I would have taken that story.
And that makes sense. It's a totally it's a total paradigm shift. I mean, that's an entirely different craft,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
it's it's interesting. I've well, I guess my first thought during that story was, "You're lucky something didn't happen to that guy because they would have come back to you and been like,
Yeah.
all right, Tom, what'd you do with the body?"
Well, let me, I hasten to add that I did not actually, so I didn't base that character solely on the guy who fired me. That character, as all my characters are composites of many different people. Like the news director I killed in that book, he was a composite of a number of different people who I had met, and not all of them were news directors. And I certainly was aware that I'm not. If I base this on one guy, even if I change his name, he might, come after me, sue me. Who the hell
Yeah.
knows? But, yeah, it was, as you said, a paradigm shift. That's totally accurate. It was just I had to reteach myself to write, outside the box, as it were.
And so this took you 10 years to write. Did you end up actually getting it published?
I self-published all my books, Zach. All my books I've self-published. The first two I published through companies that do that for you. Lulu.com is one. Ingram Spark is another. I discovered later on that you can self-publish through Amazon if you're totally willing to do everything yourself, which I am. I do all the writing, I do my own covers. I gained some graphic design chops when I left the news business, so I'm able to put some covers together that are actually decent. The the agony of writing that book was just so ridiculous. I mean, I would write a page and then walk away. That's why it took 10 years. It took a whole year just to write the ending because I didn't know how to end it. Should I, because the guy goes to, he kills his boss, then he goes to jail. Should I keep him in jail? Should I let him get him out of jail? Should I have him killed in jail? And then what about his poor wife? I had to come up with all this crap. But yeah, yeah, I self-published everything.
And I mean, that's a beast in and of itself. I've seen that investigating everything with my own book. And
Yeah.
it's funny that you say that though, because I have that a very similar relationship with my book, even though it's nonfiction, especially with the rewriting process. Like it is pulling teeth. It's the first thing that I make myself do every day because I don't like doing it. But you've written so much, you know what rewriting is like, and trying to kind of resurface things in a way that fits into your existing timeline that's there is agonizing and it sucks.
Well,
But
you're writing about yourself, right?
yeah, it's a
So
memoir
that's
that
even harder. So now you have to face all these truths and you have to figure out how much truth do you actually want to tell, right?
that's funny that you say that because I've held the opposite idea. I've never
Really?
written a novel, but I had another author on a couple days ago, and when we were talking about his books, he kind of said the same thing. He's like, "Oh, well, not non writing about yourself has to be harder." And like I took one creative writing course in college, and we had to write a short story that was somewhere between like 8 and 10,000 words, and even
Right.
that, I mean, that was tough, and that is a fraction of a book.
Hmm.
It's I don't know, but
Well, typical book, mine are all somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 words. So yeah, that's like a small fraction of a book.
yeah.
But yeah, I will say that before I started writing the novels, I did write one nonfiction book back when I was working in local TV. And it's actually probably the book I'm proudest of because I spent 4 years researching it, 4 years writing it. I wrote it in the mid '80s. There was no internet. There was no Google. There was no personal cell phones. I literally had to go to the Philadelphia Free Library and look up like microfilm of old newspapers and go through hearing testimony. And, I had to interview. I wrote it about this story that I covered in Philly in 1985. You were, of course, not born yet, but it was a big story in Philly, and it was huge, and it's still probably the worst thing that ever happened in my hometown there. But our station won an award for its coverage, and it was a really great experience just in terms of a journalist writing, covering that story because of all the obstacles. It's called Live Shot, and it really shows how we put our heads together to cover this horrible story. But I wrote that, and I was determined that this book is going to be factual and as accurate as I can possibly make it. It's not so much about me. I do write it in the first person, but it's more about the people around me who covered the story, about the circumstances, about the history of, what led up to this particular story happening. And that took a lot of work. And my role was really in the greater scheme of things. I had a pretty small role, so it was really less about me. But, I mean, and I didn't write really much personal stuff. I think as personal as I got was I think I mentioned I quit smoking. I regretted that I quit smoking a week before this story because I was dying for a cigarette. But, nonfiction is a whole different thing because, it has to, as you're finding out, if it's nonfiction, it really has to be nonfiction, and it has to be,
Yes.
it has to be correct. And if somebody decides they want to read it, you want to make sure that they're reading shit that's true, and that takes a little extra diligence other than just sitting here and making stuff up.
Yeah. And a lot of, obviously, we have different experiences with writing and nonfiction, but like a lot of my stuff is airing out a lot of my own bullshit for other people to see. And a lot of it is stuff that I'm not proud of. So that's been a bit of it's been interesting. It brought up some things that I hadn't realized I hadn't fully dealt with yet. And I
Ugh.
feel like I'm kind of facing the remainder of the last little sticking points that the book has brought up. But a lot of it's kind of deciding like, okay, what do you leave out? And that doesn't skip important notes. And I don't know, the pacing is tough with nonfiction, I feel like.
Yeah,
But
yeah, totally.
so was I guess I may have missed something here. Was this, like you said, that book was called Live Shot, correct?
Right, it's called Live Shot: Journalistic Heroism in Philadelphia, and it's on Amazon, and I just didn't like the way it looked, and I had to update it. The version that's for sale right now is the 3rd revision. I revised it twice because some facts changed, and, I revised it something like almost 20 years after I first wrote it. When I first wrote it in 1985, I went the traditional route. I actually, by pure luck, I found an agent who was actually interested and very excited about the book. She had it for a year and she couldn't sell it to save her life, probably because the incident that I reported on happened in 1985. By the time she had the manuscript, it was 1989. It was 4 years later. There had already been several other books written about this story. It was about a group called Move, including one which was considered kind of an authoritative book about that group written by a Penn professor. Plus, it's a story about Philadelphia. It doesn't necessarily have national appeal. It's very local. And she showed me all the rejection letters. It was like, oh, well written, but it's too local. It's too regional. There's already books about this. Um,
Yeah. So
and so that book the manuscript sat in my attic until 2000, no, was it 2016, maybe 2015, when I finally decided. I dusted it off. I had to digitize all the pages and I put it out there because that event happened on May 13th, 1985. Every May 13th, I make that book available for like a day for free because it made a huge impact on my life as a person and as a journalist. It happened in my hometown, in a street very much like the street I grew up on. And it still resonates in Philadelphia, mostly with old farts like me who were around at the time.
well,
But
and
yeah.
that's what I wanted to ask was it, what was it, a murder? What was this?
Okay, so real quick, Philadelphia was home to this. They were a group. They called themselves a kind of a back to nature radical group. They were anti-government. Their name was. They were called Move, Move. It's not short for anything. It was a shortening of their original name early on, which was called the Community Movement. But they called themselves Move, and they evolved from a local group that was just interested in eating natural food and not messing with the government to a group that became essentially a kind of a they really wanted to be like the Black Panthers. They were primarily their members were mostly black. They wore dreadlocks. They wore a lot of kind of tattered clothing. They were really scary to the white infrastructure. And back in 1978, they built their house in the middle of this very impacted urban neighborhood that was actually a mixed neighborhood, and that ended poorly because there was the mayor at the time, Frank Rizzo. He hated them. He thought that they were radicals. He wanted to send them all to hell. And eventually, there was a shootout there that ended up with a cop dead. So all the people in the house at that time went to jail. Fast forward to 9 years later in 1985, the remnants of that group set up shop in a little row house in West Philadelphia on a street called Osage Avenue. And they decided to move there with their children. And now you had, 11 or 12 people in this house in a row home neighborhood, and they wanted all their people in jail released from jail, which was never going to happen. So they set up a bullhorn outside their house. They would, starting on Christmas morning, 1984, they got on this bullhorn and started yelling curses and cursing out the neighbors, threatening people. And this went on like day and night for months and months, until finally the city decided, the neighbors couldn't stand it anymore. They had no access to the children. The children, they bunkered up the house. They attached wooden timbers to the windows of the house so that nobody could get in. They built a bunker on top of the roof. The police went in on May 13th, 1985, and attempted to evict them. And what ensued was a shootout that took most of the morning. And then the police dropped a bomb on top of the house. They let the fire that ensued burn so that it ended up burning down the entire block of homes, 60 some homes,
Oh my gosh.
250 people left homeless, all 11 people in the house killed, including 5 children. And subsequent to that, there was controversy over, well, why did you bomb this house? Why did you let the fire burn? Why did this happen? Why did this happen? And we, as a news organization, we were tasked with covering this because we didn't have access to the street. The police commissioner at the time made it clear that he hated the media. So we had to figure out ways to get a camera up high, and we secreted a photographer in a house across the street nobody knew. So he got all this great video of the gun. So it was like a team effort that really, and we were the only station that stayed on TV all day. We were live all day with this. And that was also a challenge. Just I was in the field kind of coordinating our reporters and making sure that we were all safe. But that went on until 1 o'clock the next morning, and it was just a really long, very challenging story to cover. But we did it, and we ended up winning the Columbia DuPont Award, which is pretty much the highest award that local TV stations can win. It's from a teaching association. It's different than an Emmy. It's really like journalists in local TV really, really strive to win that award. And it was a proud moment for us when we did it. So, my book is basically it's a combination of history of this group and how a TV station went about covering it. And it's got gun battles, it's got good guys, it's got bad guys, it's got pretty much everything you need except sex. And that comes later on in my novels.
Nice. That's what I'm talking about. And that's what we're here to talk about today. No, but that that's I was curious. I was curious because I wanted to know if that played into your EMT career. Like that's because when you initially mentioned it, you were kind of hinting at things, but I wasn't sure if it was like a big traumatic event or what happened. But was that kind of the stepping off point for you to
No, it really
volunteer?
wasn't. That was 1985. I stayed in the news business. I worked at that TV station until 1991 when I was shown the door. And right around 1991, right while I was working there, I had always liked volunteering. I had volunteered earlier. Ironically, I volunteered for a service in Philadelphia called the Radio Information Center for the Blind. So this was
There
a
we go.
carrier current station. You got it. You had to subscribe, you had to sign up, and you got a receiver. And the air was actually on a subcarrier of an FM station You with me on this? It's kind of like it's not a real radio station for the world to get, but if you have this radio tuned to this frequency, you can get it. And so the Radio Information Center for the Blind was basically people reading all this stuff. We read newspapers, they read books, they read ads. My job was to read anything that had printing on it. I read things like matchbook covers. I read theater programs. I read restaurant reviews. And I thought that was a cool thing to do because, it was easy for me to do. I was living downtown, and I thought it was important to do. That station had a huge follower, a huge listenership. So I actually knew people were listening to me. But later on, I stopped doing that because I moved out of Center City, and I had an affinity for police officers and firefighters and EMTs because part of my job was to report on that. I made a lot of contacts in at the TV station with cops, public information officers, firefighters. It was a kind of relationship where they would tell me things if I would promise not to say that it was they who told me, so that made them a confidential source. Really helpful in the news business. And I always had a lot of respect for, people, first responders. So there was a friend of mine in the newsroom who he was an ambulance driver for Ardmore Ambulance, which was a volunteer ambulance service, and I kind of was interested in that, and I inquired. And at the time, this was again in the early '90s, late '80s. Their requirements for volunteer duty were way too much. They needed all these hours during the day, and they needed a commitment for the night. And I had I mean, my job was a 12-hour a day job. So when I moved to New Jersey, to where I live right now, Fanwood, New Jersey, that I finally actually became an EMT because I had always had that interest. When I came here, I met the captain and the first lieutenant at a street fair, and I said, "I tried this before, and, the outfit wanted all these commitments." And they said, "We will take anything you can give us. If you can give us an hour, if you can give us 2 hours, whatever you can give us." And that's what I needed to hear. So I joined. That was 1998, and I became an EMT in 1999. And that was probably the most fun I've ever had with my clothes on, was being an EMT and taking people to the hospital. I wore a little pager and it would buzz and it was like, "Oh, okay, I got to go to this call now." And, I responded to over 3,000 calls. I was a member, a part of teams that saved 13 people who started out with no heartbeat. After we did CPR and AED and whatnot, we delivered
Jeez.
them to the hospital with a heartbeat and with breathing. And, it doesn't get any better than that. But some of the best calls were like, just helping a little kid. When you dial 911, most people don't ever dial 911. So it's a whole thing just pushing those three buttons.
Yeah.
So a lot of what I thought, we needed to do, and it was a priority for me, was to communicate with these people and kind of demystify the whole thing. You call 911 in my town, and suddenly there's six people in your living room. Three cops show up, and the EMT show up, maybe a firefighter and a paramedic. And, it was always important to me that, we're not talking about a life-saving situation, but we're talking about a person who's freaked out because, maybe they fractured their arm or they're having some chest pain or whatnot. Just communicating the fact that we're here to help and that it's going to be okay. That was always kind of the best part for me. So, yeah, I ended up doing that for 22 years. And part of it I did while I was working at CBS, which was, we're talking double stress here, but what the hell? As I said, the EMT thing was almost a relief from the stress of the news business.
And how far is it Fanwood?
Yeah.
How far are you from New York City?
So it's 35 miles, which doesn't sound like much. 35 miles in any part of the country is a half-hour drive. But because I live in central New Jersey and CBS is in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, it was basically an hour and a half to get there door to door. So that would
So
be whether train or car. An hour and a half was kind of the standard there.
so we're I mean, you were an EMT before 9/11. Were you down there after all that?
No, so I started EMTing in 1999, and while I was working at CBS, that job basically required me to be either in transit or working from 7 in the morning until 7 at night. I didn't get home till 7:30 many nights, so I only went on night calls or overnight calls. But when 9/11 happened, I was actually in the newsroom, And it happened to be a day when there was no other news manager in the building because they were all going to a convention. So this newsroom full of scared shitless people is looking to me. And a lot of these people in a New York newsroom, they work and they live in New York. Some of them lived in Lower Manhattan. A couple of them had my office mate, the woman I shared the office with, her husband actually worked in the World Trade Center and picked that particular day to go in late. And the stories like that are, she didn't hear from him for 2 hours and she was freaked out. Turned out he was stuck on the subway because the power was shut down and there was no cell phone
Wow.
service. But I was there in the newsroom for that, and that was where I needed to be because our department at CBS, we supplied news, video, and reports to other local news stations. And as you might imagine, that was probably the only story anybody cared about for the next week or so. So it was really important for me to be there. My squad, however, did send a crew, as many New Jersey squads did, without even being asked. They went through the Lincoln Tunnel, they went to New York, and pretty much every single squad that went was lined up along, I think it's West Avenue, and never actually went into service because, there were you either died or you weren't there that day. So none of those ambulances were actually utilized. We got a big thank you from the FDNY, but there were the only ambulances that actually probably did any good was there was a bunch that were sent to Liberty Island, which is across New York Harbor where the Statue of Liberty is. It's Liberty State Park. It's on the New Jersey side, and that's where the ferries took a lot of people who had left Lower Manhattan just for safety. And there were ambulances there who were just kind of there to look them over and to just kind of be on standby. But, nobody transported anybody from the World Trade Center because there was nobody to transport.
That's wild. I've never thought about that. And wow. Yeah, because I don't remember a lot of 9/11. I was in kindergarten, but we lived in Newark at the time. So, and my dad was a federal agent, so he wound up down there. I don't think it was the day of. I think it was in the following days, helping go through some of the rubble and stuff. But
What did he do?
he was Air Force when I was younger, and then
Mm.
at that time he had just gotten out of the Air Force and was working for the Fish and Wildlife Service.
Okay.
And so, yeah, I
So he
mean,
got recruited, huh? To go
y-
go down to the ground zero.
yeah, yeah.
Wow.
I don't remember all of what because I was too little, but
Yeah. Well,
it's a weird time, and it's especially because that was a driving force through growing up. I know there was never any doubt that I was going to go in the military, but that was still something that I thought to all the way to 2014 when I enlisted, even though I don't
that was
really
an
remember.
inspiration for you?
I mean, that same war is what was going on, and so that's
Yeah,
where
sure.
I thought I was going.
Mm.
I intentionally signed up to be an infantryman, and so that's what I thought I was going to do. And as a naive 18-year-old, you're like, well, yeah, the best way for me to serve my country is to go to war. So that's what I'm going to do. Just kind of wild, but and something else I thought of while you were talking a little bit about your experience. I don't know. This is a tough question to ask. I'm kind of curious because I've thought about this a lot,
Yeah,
especially as
just ask it.
okay, especially as I've healed. For people who are listening and don't know, I lost my sight almost 6 years ago to a suicide attempt when I shot myself in the face. I've wondered, you know, cops and paramedics and EMTs responded to that. It, it is what
Spit it out, young man. Spit it out.
yeah, that's I'm trying to think. I don't even know exactly what to ask other than, I mean, I don't know if you've ever shown up to a scene like that, but what is that like as a first responder when you show up to something like that?
To something where somebody's died, for example, or there's some horrific scene.
Yeah, something, I mean, that's a pretty mortal thing to see, especially if someone's died.
Yeah,
Or
sure. I mean, I've been on several calls where individuals have died either naturally or unnaturally. I really have to say everyone was different. I've been on two suicide calls, and in each case, it was a husband who was going through something, who was married. And in one case, the wife was home and she heard this was a gentleman who shot himself in the head in his basement with a very large caliber revolver. And the other case was a woman who was at work and came home to find her husband had hung himself, I think with the telephone cord. Um,
Jesus.
and then I was also at a couple of deaths where, I mean, we have an assisted living here in Fanwood, and there were several times when, and this is not uncommon in the living, in assisted living, you've got men and women in their 80s and 90s, and sometimes they don't wake up. Like that's my dad. My dad was 91. He lived in an independent living, and one day he just didn't wake up. He was 91. It was his time. And you go because they call 911 because they don't know why they didn't wake up. Those are kind of easier calls to make. You can tell pretty much right away. And as EMTs, you're kind of allowed to make an assessment that somebody is deceased. That's not for everybody, but we have a little list of things we go through. But the suicides are more traumatic, really, for the people who are the survivors. The family members. I'm sure you know this as well. I mean, the poor woman, the guy who shot himself. She was completely she couldn't even talk. I mean, she was so distraught. And when I police officer escorted me down to the basement where the guy was, because I had to make sure that he was indeed passed. And he had put the gun up to the side of his head, and there was an entrance wound and an entry wound, right? So it went right through his brain, but he still had a pulse, which was just bizarre to me. So he had a pulse, so we started CPR. And then we ended up taking him to a trauma center near us, University Hospital in Newark. Um, and the paramedic who was with us, he knew that it was going to be a lost cause. He knew that he wouldn't make it to the hospital, and indeed
Yeah.
he did not. But I just my memory there is of the poor wife, who she heard the gunshot, and then she smelled the gun. I mean, it was just awful. The individual who hung himself. Um, I just peeked in on that. The police officer who got there before me, he had already assessed that he had passed. I just peeked into that room, and the guy's sitting there with the phone cord around his neck. He had somehow lashed it over the door or something. And the wife was absolutely despondent. We could hear her screaming from 2 blocks away as the ambulance was, and then she would vacillate between being completely coherent, completely with it, and then suddenly it would hit her again what happened. You got to
Jeez.
believe something like that is going to stay with those people forever. You don't ever
Yeah.
really get over that. So, but as far as I was concerned, it was like, you go through EMT training, and paramedics go through the same thing, and cops do too, that you're going to come upon death at some point, right? And I can't say that, I remember some of the visceral things, especially the guy who shot himself, but I can't say it gave me nightmares or that it stayed with me for that long, really. I was, as I said, I was more affected by the wife. Something that stayed with me longer was we had a woman who was electrocuted. This poor woman, she was in her 20s. She was apparently driving home from work one day, and this massive thunderstorm opened up right over our town. She did the right thing by pulling over to the side of the road, and then we assessed that after she pulled over, a power line broke and landed on top of her car, right? She saw,
Jesus.
she had the wherewithal to see that this power line was draped over her car. So she looked out the driver's side window and said, "Oh, I see the power line. I'm not getting out." Then she decided, okay, I'm going to get out on the passenger side. And of course, did not see that the live wire was right in the gutter where she stepped. So she stepped on this live
Oh,
wire. It probably killed her instantly. We were called and had to stay away for 20 minutes looking at this smoking deceased
just
woman in the
cooking
distance
corpse. Yeah.
because the power was still on. We had to wait for the PSE&G guys to come up. So they finally told us it was odd, and I went down with my partner and a group of firefighters and a police officer. And the woman's, I mean, she was obviously dead. The flesh on her leg from about mid thigh down had been completely burned off. And I never saw anything like that. This was like, I imagine this would must be what it looks like when a soldier steps on an IED. It just obliterates everything from there on down. And she was sitting there, her eyes were closed. her face looked really peaceful, but that was a sight that stayed with me for a while. That actually prompted the captain of my squad to arrange what they call a critical incident stress debriefing, CISD. And
Yeah.
they thought you probably have something like that in the military. When you see something traumatic, something that they're worried is going to stay with you, they get a guy or a woman, somebody who's been through this. It's usually another cop or a paramedic. They get everybody together and they basically just want you to talk about it to make sure that, you're not being affected by it. And, I don't know if it's because we were all a bunch of, macho assholes, but none of us were really affected by it. And we wanted to make sure everybody knew we were okay.
Yeah,
But,
that sounds like men.
that stuff happens and that's, death is part of that being that first responder thing. And, that's a very long answer to your question.
Yeah, and I mean, I was in nursing school when I shot myself, so I had seen some dead bodies while I was doing
Yeah. Mhm.
clinicals and stuff like that, and then while when I was in the Marines, like going through infantry school and stuff like that, and some of the advanced schools that I got sent to, it was basically like the go-to, like the status quo for attention getters before a class was showing like beheading videos or people,
Oh,
just
great.
crazy shit like
Mm,
that. But
yeah.
that's very different from seeing it in person. So
Yeah,
I was
sure.
always curious, and I didn't go to combat, so I haven't seen any of that stuff in person. All the dead people that I saw were just it was old people who passed away at a hospice center. So,
Gotcha.
but yeah, I've always wondered, like, especially or specifically with my suicide attempt, like, fuck, man, someone came to that, and I wound up waking up in the middle of it, and I don't remember any of that, but I was talking with a bullet hole in my forehead, and like just always been curious.
Yeah, well, think of all the stories you generated for all those people who took care of you.
Yeah,
It's kind of a
yeah.
gallows way to look at it, but I think it's unique to have somebody like you who, not only survived, but I mean, like you got your shit together, and it's amazing to me,
Well, and I got lucky that that I still have my faculties, man. I
Yeah,
mean,
really.
it just I got lucky. I don't know how. I did, but
Well, all I can say about your question is that everybody reacts differently to death in general, even, the death of a family member, the death of somebody that's not traumatic. Everybody has a different way of dealing with that. And, the challenge for us as human beings is to just be sensitive to that and give people the space they need to deal with it, whatever that is.
yeah, it's another form of stress, a very should be for most people a very very rare form of stress, but
Yeah, of course.
and as because your books now follow basically a like a troubled EMT, correct? Is
So, no, just the one book that I just wrote, the Wreck and Return, the book returned about when I shamelessly promoted it on your podcast.
yeah.
That's a fictionalized version of my life as both a news guy and an EMT. But that started out as I really wanted to write that as a memoir, as a true story, because I had so many. I mean, I just told you a couple of them. I have, over 20 some years. I have a lot of stories, not just traumatic stories, but positive stories about things that were good. Kids who we took a kid to the hospital one night because he had croup. We had a lot of that. Kids who
Yeah.
cough and they're, it's just horrible. And that night, I made friends with this 3-year-old kid in the back of the ambulance. And when we went to the hospital, we, checked him into the bed and his mom was with him. He cried when I left. He wanted to hug me. He gave me a hug because we chatted in the hospital. It was so cute. And there's a lot of stories kind of like that, stories with happy endings. A lot of times people call 911 and there's I won't say there's nothing wrong with them, but it's never as bad as they think it is. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
it's that
just
subjective
Yeah,
perspective.
it was just the one book that wrote about that. My other books are completely made up books about a guy who's in the news business, a guy who's got anger issues. I think I had some anger issues in my younger days. And he's married and the wife has to put up with his bullshit. And that's what 3 of those books are about. And then I've also written a couple sci-fi books that are just totally different.
And I can't remember, do you have kids?
Yeah, so I have 2 grown sons. One is just turned 38. He's actually a police officer in my town. And I have a son who's 35 who is he's tried to explain to me a million times. He basically is a cybersecurity guy. He works for a company called SecureWorks, which is a subsidiary of Dell, and they deal with any kind of cyber IT security issues that any company might have. Everything from employees who use password as their password to ways of kind of shoring up their firewall so they don't get hacked. A lot of education and a lot of now he works totally from home. He's never met his boss. They send him computers and phones and he loves it. So yeah,
That is so weird. He's
yeah,
never
it
met his
really is.
boss.
Yeah.
But and gosh, so because I was curious, you've been sober for like 23 years now. Was that an issue for you at some point along this timeline?
Sure. So from let's see, the years I stopped drinking in 2001, ironically, 2 months, 3 months before 9/11. So that means from 1998 to 2001, 98, 99, 200. So for like 6 years, 5 years, I was working in the news business, I was an EMT, and I was drinking heavily. So what does drinking heavily mean? So in my case, I would come home at the end of my shift. I went right to the vodka. For a while, I was playing with, vodka martinis, and then I thought that adding that little glurg of dry vermouth was
It's a
stupid and pointless.
waste.
So
Yeah.
I just went right to straight vodka, and I started drinking. I started drinking vodkas on the rocks. And so I would start, say, at 6:30, 7 o'clock at night, and typically, I would have 3 or 4 of those and either pass out in my chair or go to sleep kinda drunk. There were, and I grapple with myself on this question because I don't really have a full memory of it, but I'm fairly certain that I went on a couple of EMT calls, drunk. I don't believe I acted drunk. I didn't smell drunk.
Yeah.
But, I got into my car and I drove to the rescue squad, which was only half a mile away. I did not drive the ambulance in those early days, but I went on patient calls and I wasn't the primary caregiver, but I was there in people's homes. And I can't say that happened a lot because on the nights I was on call, I try I tried to stop drinking or I tried to convince myself that I would stop drinking. And some nights I did and some nights I didn't. But it became an issue mostly because, I did my best drinking in my den watching TV with my sons, and there were a couple instances when I would pass out or I would have a blackout, and my kid would wake me up and said, "Dad, what did you mean by what you just said?" And I had no idea
Oh,
what the hell I just said. I babbled some shit, probably something I heard on the TV, and that happened twice. And then there was one day, I was my wife and I were eating breakfast or something, and she said something like, "Boy, you were really a wild man last night." And I said, "What do you mean by that?" And basically, we had had, a husband and wife moment together, and I had no memory of it whatsoever. 0.
nice.
So that would be the ultimate blackout, right? My wife complimented me on my sex, and I didn't remember it. So it was like,
Yeah, that should
all
be
right.
one for the record books, and
Yeah,
you weren't
exactly.
even there. Damn.
So right around this same time, in the late '90s, I got a new boss at CBS. And unlike the old boss I had, he and I never really got on the same page. We had a number of disagreements on a number of things, and he ultimately fired me. But part of the issue there was I would get angry at him, and we had a couple of fairly loud arguments that I started in front of the other people in the newsroom. And 2 times he pulled me into his office and said, "Look, if you don't want to do this, I'm going to fire you." And so I had to kind of pull back and say, "I'm really sorry." But I had anger issues. I think a lot of it didn't have to do with him. A lot of it had to do with the first time I was fired. I hated having to move to New Jersey because I hated New Jersey, blah, blah, blah. So I
Just
started
kind of
seeing
like bitter.
yeah, bitterness that was actually predated him. So I finally, he said, "You better see somebody about this." So I went and called my employee assistance program, which gave 8 free sessions with a therapist. So I saw a therapist about that. And those pesky therapists, they swoop right in on your substance abuse, right? First thing they ask you is, "Do you drink? And how much do you drink?" And so, of course, I said, "Yes, I drink." And then my stock answer always was, "Oh, yeah, I have 2 drinks every night." And
Yeah.
that's ironically the same answer I used to get from every drunk driver I ever met on an EMS call. "Oh, yeah, I had 2 beers. I had 2 wines." The number 2, There's this George Thorogood song about one whiskey, one bourbon, one rye. So I always think of that because it's always two, two, two. So this therapist actually knew that I was full of shit because she's probably seen this a million times. And she
Yes.
actually made me kind of think about, okay, how much am I actually drinking? And so I thought about it and I realized, she helped basically open my eyes to the fact that this was a problem. And I just one day I ran out of vodka and it was 8 o'clock at night. And instead of running out to the liquor store, I just said, screw it. I'm not buying it tonight. I'm just going to drink some tonic on the rocks. And that was July 3rd, 2001. And I haven't looked back since then. First 2 weeks were
Damn.
kind of hard because I was always in the habit of, half of it was just having something in my hand, it was the same as smoking. But after the first 2 weeks, it was like, I can do this. And I did. I didn't start going to meetings until months afterwards because, at the beginning I said I can do this myself, which I did, but it was really helpful to hear from other people and to be able to say out loud, my name is Tom and I am an alcoholic. Because when you say that, it's amazing the burden that is lifted off you. Once you see it for what it is, it's like, okay, let's go from here now that I've actually admitted it. So that's kind of what that story is. Again, very lengthy.
Yeah, but I mean, it sounds almost like for you, it was kind of like okay, I'm very stressed because I'm burning the candle at both ends between work and volunteering. And is that because I feel you have a very anticlimactic getting sober story. You're like, yeah, I
I
realized
know,
I
I
had a
know, I have
problem and
no
I stopped.
I know, I didn't hit a rock bottom, I never wrapped my car around a telephone pole, I didn't get fired because of that, I actually got fired 6 years after I stopped drinking. Yeah, and I've been on the phone with, I did actually a podcast with a guy from the American Stress Institute. There is such a thing called the American Stress Institute, and they do a podcast. And I told him all this same stuff I'm telling you, and he said, "So did you have a rock bottom moment?" That's always the dramatic moment that people ask you when they ask about your recovery. And I said, "No, not really. I just decided one night to stop." And I know it's boring and it doesn't sound true, but that's really what happened.
Well, and that's like I'm on the other end of the spectrum where I'll and I talk about this in my book. I'm like, yeah, you'd think shooting yourself in the face would be rock bottom, but I picked that shit right back up and went on for another 2.5 years. And but like that time, it was like I almost didn't have a bottom that I could hit.
Yeah.
I don't know. I
Well, I
wish,
don't know. That sounds like it was different shit though. Different shit. The
yeah,
suicide was over here, but the drinking was over here. Maybe they were parallel lines of behavior. I don't know.
yeah, I don't know. It's just, man, I was hoping you'd get into some nitty gritty, like,
Yeah,
yeah,
sorry, man. Sorry.
damn,
I
maybe,
found out from going to meetings, and I don't know if you've been to a lot of meetings. I'm not a big advocate of meetings. I went to a lot in like the first year and then I kind of trailed off, but I found out at meetings that most people who are alcoholics, they don't have a rock bottom story. They're just like me. They drink in their home, they drink in their basement, they drink at work, they hide it from people, and they only come to it because their family gets fucked up or their kids call them on it. There were very few kind of horrible stories of car accidents and DWIs. There were more stories of people who just felt lost. So I like to tell people, I drank in the privacy of my home. You can quit drinking in the privacy of your home as well.
yeah. And I've tried meetings before. It's not my thing. I just
Yeah, no, it's not
honest,
for everybody.
yeah, I was stubborn enough, I guess, that eventually after 2.5 years, something finally stuck. A lot of that was kind of once I'd found my purpose again. And once I'd found my purpose again, then I started making progress. And I hit a year in December, but like, yeah, I don't know.
Did
It's
you
hard.
interview, by the way, did you interview the judge, Judge O'Connor?
She will be coming on here in a couple weeks.
All right, that's
She's
ironic that we talk about this because she was not a big 12-step person. She during her recovery, and she recovered from the stuff she did. Wait till you hear her story. She's nothing. I mean, we're nothing compared to her. She tried the 12-step story, and the 12 steps programs, as you probably know, the basis of them is that you have to turn yourself over to a God
A
or a
higher
higher
power.
power, right?
Yep.
We all like to say higher power because we're not sure what God means. She pretty much, I think, kind of rejects that for herself. She always wanted to feel like it was her control that she wanted. She wanted to be in control of her sobriety,
And
not
I
some
fall into that camp. And that's
right.
why like
And
AA wasn't my thing. So
right.
I'm
And to that
excited.
to that answer, she has a whole list of other alternative recovery programs that she talks about on her website and that we mentioned in the podcast. And it's like, yeah, for people out there looking for recovery, AA and 12 steps is not the only way. There are other things that work for sure.
Yeah, and it's hard because it's like anything else where people find their thing and then that's their camp. And so they want to almost profess that to everyone. But I do think it can be um kind of detrimental sometimes, maybe to people who are really struggling and like that first try doesn't work. But
I think it
it's
chases some people away, frankly. I really do. A lot of people have this, they don't have a clear understanding of what God is or what even a higher power is. I kind of came to think that I am a small cog in a greater wheel that is kind of life in the universe. But I basically went to the meetings to hear other people's stories. That's why I went, and that's what was helpful to me. I never had like the 12 steps plastered on my refrigerator and went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. A lot of people are just like, you got to follow the steps, you got to follow the steps. But there are other things to do for sure.
yeah. So um so today your your eighth book is the book that you so shamelessly promoted during our episode on your podcast, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Is it available now?
Oh, yeah. So it's called Wreck and Return, as in car wreck and then come back from the return. Wreck and Return, an EMT's journey into and out of darkness. So I think it was released last February. So I'm coming up on a year. It's all over. It's on Amazon, and I think it's on Apple Books as well. But Amazon is my main platform. It's there as a soft cover, a hard cover, an ebook, and there's also an audiobook version of it as well.
Awesome. Are you working on any projects right now? Any new
Yeah,
ones?
so I'm writing a third and final science fiction book that follows up the first two I wrote. The second one is kind of a follow up to it's kind of a series. It's loosely strung together by the same good guy and the same bad guy. But yeah, I'm writing one right now. It's my first one was called Time Travel Rescue. The second one is called Moon Rescue, and this one is called Hack Rescue. And it's going to be about how a 10-year-old child finds out that the systems that are keeping people on this gigantic dome in the moon are being hacked by a bad guy, and the child hacks the hacker. And I'm still kind of working it out. I'm about halfway through it right now, but that'll probably be ready in the spring sometime.
Well, if you keep it up, you could start a religion. I don't know if you've
Yeah.
ever heard this, but L. Ron Hubbard, the guy who started Scientology,
Oh,
I think
yes. I
was
know
the
about
most
L. Ron Hubbard.
prolific writer of all
Yeah,
time.
I know.
But it all started with science fiction.
Yeah.
Well,
No, I'm not going to start a religion, I don't think.
all right. Well, keep it in your back pocket if you get bored.
All right. Thanks.
Do you want to tell everyone about Type Tune Tint?
Yeah. So the podcast that we met on is called Type Tune Tint. Type stands for writers, Tune stands for musicians, Tint stands for artists. The whole point of the podcast is to find people who found their creativity in either unexpected places, late in life, or were in denial about a talent because they were too busy raising kids or having a career. I think, Zach's found his creativity, following, a traumatic event and in sobriety. But, look at where he is now. He designed a word game, and he's doing, a podcast, and he's writing. I would say that that's a pretty unique story of creative discovery. But, I also interviewed a news anchor who anchored in Boston for 30 years. In her 60s, she realized she could draw, and now she's a painter, and she's an in-demand painter. She paints acrylic on canvas, and she's really good. There's a lot of
That's so
stories like
cool.
that. It's about people who they always wanted to do it, but they never gave themselves permission to do it. That's kind of like the recurring theme. She said,
Well,
I didn't know I had permission to be an artist. And I said, well, what the fuck do you need permission for? Just do it. And so that's kind of the point. All these people who have become writers and artists and musicians who didn't think they had permission to do it. It's
and
interesting.
yeah, I think that's a very common thing, especially I don't have kids, but you hear people who do have kids and have a family talk about stuff like that. And I think that's neat that you're helping spread that, hey, you can break that mold. You can have hobbies and delve into these things and just figure it out as you go. So
Well, and it turns out a lot of the people have really interesting stories, interesting, not only stories about trauma and survival, although that is, sobriety and recovery and bad things that happen to people are very often what spurs them into creativity. It's cathartic for them. It's another outlet. It's something that they discover about themselves. But a lot of people are just like, I think I'm going to try this. I'm successful, but maybe I can write this story. I just interviewed an author who is a successful special ed teacher in where is he, in Los Angeles somewhere, and he wrote a sci-fi book that's doing great, and he's in his 30s. He never, decided to write a book before, but he did. So, there's hope. Zach, you too can be a best-selling author.
well, we'll see. I think my book is pretty crude, even though it touches on a lot of serious stuff. So we'll see. But
It's
everyone
probably a lot better than you think it is.
will, yeah, I
I
hope
guess you'll
so.
find out.
Yeah. Well, I'm working through the second draft right now, and we'll see what happens once I actually finish that and let people read it and give me
Yeah, I
feedback.
can't wait.
So, do you have anything else you want to point people to?
No, just your podcast when it comes on. Of course, it'll have been on by the time this airs, and when your book comes out, we're going to meet again. We're going to shamelessly promote your book,
From my palatial estate.
your palatial estate, and wherever the hell you are,
Yeah. All right.
Colorado somewhere, right?
Yeah.
The
And
wilds of Colorado.
yeah, I've been to the Denver burbs. So
Okay, cool.
yeah, thanks for coming on, man. I really appreciate what you're doing. I appreciate you having me on your show. And I think you definitely did a better job interviewing me than I did interviewing you, but this was a
Oh, I
lot
don't
of
know about
fun.
that. You covered all the good stuff, and this was a nice, easy conversation, and that's the key, man. If you're relaxed, it makes the guest relaxed, and then we talk about all kinds of stuff, and you got to tell us to shut up at some point. So it was a pleasure being on here. It's a pleasure knowing you, even in this kind of weird way, because you're truly just a remarkable person. Maybe you're sick of hearing that, but you're inspiring to me. And, you're one of those people who, I just want to point people to him and say, look what he did. Shut the fuck up and stop complaining about your shitty life.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully that gets through to people who need to hear
Yeah, I
it.
think it
So,
will. All right, take
yeah.
care, man. It was really a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks. And thank you everyone for listening to episode 7 of Going In Blind. And to everyone at home, thank you for listening. Please take a second to help me grow the show so that I can keep delivering these conversations week after week for years to come. Subscribe, rate, and review the show in whatever podcasting app you're using right now, and check out the show notes to follow me on social media and YouTube as well. When you share your favorite episodes, tag me and use the hashtag GoingInBlind. You can also join my mailing list at zachtidwell.net. And if you know someone you think I should talk to, have them send me an email at contact.goinginblind@gmail.com.